And thank you very much, Punita, for joining us this evening and helping us understand what to really make of these market moves. So my first question to you is, what do you make of what lies ahead of us, and how will the markets then react?
Well, first of all, I think the market was reacting very strongly to the exit polls. But the ground reality, if you spoke to the people on the ground, was not as optimistic. And so I think we've seen some of that coming into the voting patterns today. And while I think the NDA and the BJP obviously will form the government, it will not be as strong a formation as had been widely expected. And so the boldness with which they could do the 100-day agenda and the reforms may now come a little bit under the cloud because they will have to take their coalition partners along with them. Having said that, I think we will still see most of those priorities being fulfilled. But I think some of the resources may get reallocated to areas or pockets where BJP has not won, so that they realize that they probably realize after the election, and they'll do the analysis, where are those areas and what needs to be spent and where, because there's a lot of assembly elections coming up as well. So there could be some reallocation from the resources and the financial resources to what was probably targeted at some other older reforms, to something that could be more of a rural spend, or more of supporting the minorities and things like that.
Right, so very interesting points that you've made, Punita, and we'll go over them one by one. But I think since you said that, it looks like that the BJP is going to form the government. But let me also take you back to what Mr. Rahul Gandhi said just a short while back. He said that as far as reports that state that Congress will also stake claim to the government, he said that they will have a chat with the alliance partners, post which they will probably decide. So the scenario is pretty fluid. Now, given that kind of a situation, what really happens as far as the markets are concerned? Are the markets really pricing that in as of now?
No, I don't think the markets are pricing India-led government. I think the markets are pricing a BJP-led government even after the fall today. But of course, what the fall reflects is that it won't be a strong, it will be a coalition government. So I think if you look at the total number of seats, BJP still has the majority. So I think BJP will be able to form the government, according to my understanding. And they are together, the NDA does cross the majority mark. So the only difference I see happening is that there'll be a lot more debate. It may be not as easy to get bills passed in the Lok Sabha as we saw in the prior regime. So a lot of the constitutional changes or bills that were being expected to be passed may not happen so quickly.
So what is it that you're advising investors and, of course, your clients as well, on what should be the investment strategy of your clients and, of course, investors going forward in such a scenario?
So first of all, we have to look at the long-term returns of the Indian markets. Over the last 20 years or so, India is only second best performing market to the US in dollar terms. So the India's inherent growth trajectory is really being supported by the very attractive demographics and the consumption demand, plus the large pool of domestic capital that is keeping the equity markets buoyant. So the domestic capital has very limited places where they can invest. They cannot invest much overseas. India doesn't have full capital account convertibility, so the money has to stay within India. So either it will go into real estate or gold or into bank deposits, which means that the banks could get flush with cash, or it would go into equity markets. And the long-term trajectory, and especially with the SIPs, is still good for the investor in India. And so I think that, yes, there may be a short-term hiccup, but longer-term investors don't have much choice but to invest in the Indian market. And with this correction, the valuations will also become a little bit more rational. And so the foreign investors at some point will start looking back at investing in India. Although right now, I think they'll stay on the sidelines.
So you basically are saying that foreign investors or FIIs will remain on the sidelines, and that was going to be my next question to you, considering the kind of solid moves that we've seen from FIIs. But how soon do you think that sort of volume that had been coming in, the past few months will be able to be back? How soon will that happen?
So I think, first of all, they'll wait for some clarity on the new government formation as to how many seats will be given, cabinet seats will be given to coalition partners, who's going to run the various ministries. That process could take a week to form. And so I think there's no rush for the foreign investors to invest into India, especially because valuations are not that dirt cheap. And they have many other alternatives to invest as well. Even on the manufacturing and export side, foreign investors are looking at Vietnam, they're looking at Bangladesh. Those are also countries with good demographics. China, if China's reform agenda speeds up, then China's valuations are very attractive as compared to India. And India's benefited a lot from the China trade, the loss of China's growth momentum. So foreign investors can invest in many different emerging markets, many different markets with better valuation. So why should they take the risk right now when we don't have full clarity on the new government formation? Even though one is assuming that BJP will form the government, there could be some, uncertainty. So why rush in? But at some point when the new government is formed, and in this week itself and leading up to the new government, there could be volatility in the Indian market. Markets could correct further, which would make the valuations a little bit more, as I said, rational and sane. And that would also then make the whole market more attractive in a couple of weeks, a month maybe. But leading up to state elections, we have to be mindful that there are going to be some priority shifts that may happen, so that the governments ensure, and all political parties ensure, that they win the state elections wherever they're going to happen.
Right. Right. So one very important point that I wanted to take from what you said earlier, Punita, and that was really about reallocation of priorities, reallocation of budgets, especially, now that we have the budget coming up reportedly in July itself, and some resources or areas may get reallocated. Now, I want to bring your attention to this very, prominent or a priority area of the government, which is, remained since the past 4 or 5 years, and that's been in the space of tech, semiconductor, EVs, renewable energy, all of these areas. But I think, some of these sectors, for example, the semiconductor sector, it requires a lot of funding, it requires a lot of cash, it requires a lot of capital, it takes a lot of time to get set up as well, at least a minimum of a decade or so. Do you think there will be some sort of an impact as far as those sectors are concerned?
I think in the near term, yes. I think some elements of manufacturing that are not urgent or imminent could take a backseat. But of course, anything to do with EVs and greener India, that I think is going to remain a priority for any government. I mean, you've seen the temperatures in Delhi. Climate change is upon us. So every government is going to keep that as a high priority area, and investment in those sectors will continue domestically as well as from foreign investors. So that segment I'm less worried about, but some other pockets of manufacturing may take a backseat to certain rural spending, because rural India is not flourishing as well. And the job creation across both rural and urban India, if the graduates from the IITs included, many of them haven't found jobs. So I think job creation is very important. And of course, some of that comes through manufacturing, but it also comes from, perhaps the government needs to start moving certain capex and certain spending into the rural areas. And I could see that shift might happen because of the upcoming elections as well, and also with the election verdict that we've seen.
All right. So, interestingly, a lot of focus will then be on the rural economy and how the rural economy, overall sectors associated with the rural economy, can be really given a massive push. I want to also ask you about, the RBI dividend. It was a record-breaking dividend that was given out, that will be given out to the government. And considering that it is just ahead of the budget, when you said that some areas may be reprioritized, maybe relooked at, what kind of an impact do you think that RBI dividend is going to have on the budget? And of course, it's the government's capability to spend that or increase its capex. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so first of all, our fiscal deficit is still higher than what um, we would call fiscal consolidation trend. And while the GDP denominator is growing, still I think it could come down further or should come down further, perhaps. But again, with the elections coming up, maybe this is not the year that they will do fiscal consolidation, and therefore this large dividend, whether it's from RBI or we may see from other PSUs down the road, could be maybe that extra windfall that is used to spend towards rural and other parts of the economy that need attention without actually sacrificing on the manufacturing and PLI schemes, etc. So it's very hard to guess. You're all guessing right now without even knowing who's going to be which minister and what the 100-day agenda of the government will, the new NDA government would look like. So I think some more clarity until that happens. It's all guesswork that we are doing.
It's all guesswork, and there might be some bit of volatility, as you earlier mentioned. On that note, Punita, let's listen in now to some of the other market voices that we had the opportunity to speak with. We spoke with Ramdev Agarwal, Sandeep Tandon, and Vallabh Bansali, all of whom have weighed in on what really happens next to the markets now that this big event, elections, is out of the way. Of course, we're waiting for the final verdict and how that really swings the market. But let's hear out their opinions on the same.
Have some patience. I think let's have some appetite for some more correction. I would say another 5-10% correction on the downside, and I hope it is only 10%. And then I think corporate earnings, dialogue will change, new government will come, and the corporate earnings, the winners will come, maybe some change in policies will happen. I would think that with this mandate, we will not have a great year. In terms of the bulk of the time will go in correction, and whatever excess return we had in last 2-3 years, part of that we have to give in next 12 months. I'm preparing my mind for kind of very low return or no return for in near future.
I think if we remain constructive for India from a longer term perspective, I think these are great buying opportunities. And I will generally like these things, whenever a fraud gets built, you give you sharp correction and all weak players are out. So again, market becomes a healthy. Now, this statement, people will not like it at this point in time because everybody's portfolio will hurt very badly. But the point is very important, the way when we look at from the institution perspective, these are great opportunities to build or reconstruct your portfolio.
Long-term trend of Indian economy, I do not think is here to change. The most important development in the last few years, or last couple of years maybe, was the trend in investment cycle. As long as that investment cycle does not get dented, I think the Indian story will continue.
All right. Those are some of the market voices that we spoke to earlier in the day. But going back to you, Punita, I want to understand from you on the sectors that you are really bullish on, considering any of these governments that they come up with, and looking at the manifesto promises that both of these parties made and their alliances made. So which sectors will you be bullish on?
First of all, the sectors which have somewhat defensive and not as geared to the Indian economy in the short term. I think those are the sectors that I would say would be like FMCG, which of course is very geared to the Indian economy, but where the valuations, those companies, the large caps in particular, haven't really had like the amazing run that we've seen in many other mid and small caps and other sectors. And I think with the thrust potentially on the rural economy, that sector could benefit. I think pharma, that's a secular story. Healthcare doesn't depend on governments. And also, healthcare as a sector is very geared to what happens in the US, the generic market, and that so far Indian companies have been quite well this year. So I think pharma, IT, the valuations are reasonable as an if and when. Of course, there's some uncertainty on the US economy and the elections there, and the tech sector itself is only slowly recovering. But you could find pockets of opportunities there. And then anything fintech. I think fintech is again not dependent on government intervention as much anymore because all the policies and the roadmap is in place. And now it's just depending on the inherent consumer demand of the Indian consumer and their using of digital financial payments. So I think that segment could do well, and anything that is linked to the consumer would be a good sector to be in. I think if valuation's correct of some of the other sectors that have been high flyers, then one could relook at them. And I think today's correction and the next potentially few days, we may see some corrections, would give some potential good opportunities for investors to again enter those that they missed.
Right. And which sectors do you think are the most vulnerable given the conditions and how circumstances are shaping up?
I think mid and small caps, which were getting a little frothy, particularly some of them which were just running on the back of like domestic capex story, which may slow down a little bit, or like potential for significant growth that may now be curtailed. So I think those one should be careful about. PSUs, I would be a little bit more cautious. Although if they're correct, then those again could look quite decent because their valuations are anyway okay. Financial sector, I think, could also do fine. Particularly the private sector banks could do fine because if investors stay on the sideline and put their money back into bank deposits, then the banks will be flush with capital and they could potentially start lending more aggressively. So I think those sectors would, like the financials overall, I think would also be fine. But I would be a little worried about the smaller, sectors that were like going up on very high euphoria and very high expectation of capex.
Okay, all right. And I also wanted to understand from you on, the economy of the country, on a whole, and the broad direction of the economy, the country's economy. Do you think that is unlikely to change, or will there be some changes? I mean, we've seen several market experts and economists say that regardless of whichever government comes in, it is not going to have a large impact on the country's economic trajectory. It's been seen as a bright spot by its global peers. But wasn't that largely due to the policies of this government, this outgoing government, the BJP government, especially its China plus one policy? Wouldn't you credit it to that? And secondly, if you could also weigh in on this point about the impact on the country's economy over the next couple of months.
So, India's economy is being driven by a very strong secular trend of its demographics and this young population. And that trend will keep the Indian economy going strongly. What the governments are doing are providing policies, policy areas of trust and governance. But the inherent demand is being created by the 1.4 billion people that we have in India. And so that is not changing. And if you've seen, various governments over the last, history of India, we've had many coalition governments, and it's not like the GDP has dropped dramatically in those years. There is a band of 6 to 8%, maybe 5 to 8% that we've seen India grow at, and we'll continue to see India grow at, of course. And even if the government, the government will, whatever policy stimulus they come up with and policy priorities, that doesn't reflect in the economy immediately. It takes years for the trickle-down effect to happen and years before any positive or negative impact might happen. So right now, for the next couple of years, we are going to benefit from whatever has been put in place already. And what happens with the government isn't going to change that or alter that trajectory anytime soon. So as of now, I think there is going to be no big shift immediately onto our economic growth. What might shift, as I said, capital flows, but FDI was anyway not as high as I think the government would have liked. And I think we'll have to make a lot of effort to ensure that the new government can give confidence to foreign investors to come and invest more in the FDI through FDI route.
Right. And one final question, Punita, before we let you go. I want to understand from you, or one word of advice that you would give to investors and potential investors.
My one bit of advice is that India has tremendous opportunity for wealth creation, for companies, for investors, and for everybody who is now in this ecosystem. And while there may be hiccup right now, that opportunity still exists, and that opportunity is not going to change. And so keep the faith.
All right, so keep the faith intact, and the Indian market offers a lot of opportunity. That, remember, is the word coming in, viewers, from Punita. Thank you very much, Punita, for joining us this evening and sharing your thoughts on the way forward for the markets and the trajectory that it could take, and which sectors will be in focus and which sectors perhaps that investors should remain a little cautious about. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, it's time's up from us on this broadcast, but lots more coming up on the other side, so do stay tuned with 18-hour continuous coverage of Lok Sabha elections. Mandate 2024 continues on ET Now.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to ET Now.